Hi, everyone. So my name is Weishaupt. I'm a graduate student at the Graduate School of East Asian Studies at the Free University in Berlin. And my presentation today is back in social sciences, and it's about how non-official evacuees, so I call them self-evacuees, return to Fukushima, what that means in their lives. So it's a summary of a chapter that will come out on the 20th of October in this edited volume by Professor Tsujiuchi and Professor Gill. So my presentation will be as follows. I will just give a few comments on the context in which self-evacuees are returning. Then there will be a bit on how I collected the data, and then we'll move on to the topic by addressing the issue of invisibility and risk construction, what brings people home, their struggles to redefine safety and to implement radioprotection in social political environment that is constraining their action, and then a few words of conclusion. So I won't really spend much time here because I know that most of us are very aware of what is happening right now. I would just say that the background currently is the acceleration of the return policy. So we see it with the complete reopening of what used to be those green and yellow zones. And now we see the reopening of smaller areas, those special zones of revitalization within the difficult to return zone. And of course, this August, there was also a reopening in the town of Taba, which is very symbolic. And the reopening does not necessarily mean that the population is simply returning. Of course, we have seen also through polls and surveys that there are a lot of concerns when it comes to returning to the difficult to return zone, may it be from issues related to contamination, decontamination, storage facilities, job opportunities, missing facilities like clinics and schools, and of course, like the changing in demographics. There's also the point that many families who have young children are now settled in their in other municipalities, and that makes it also harder to decide to return. And of course, like with the reopening of those special zones of revitalization, this is a point that will need to be looked at carefully in order to understand the complex consequences of this return process. But there's a point within return policy that tends to be a bit overshadowed, and this is the point of, the case of non-official evacuees. So the presentation's goal and the chapter in general is, the goal is to shed light on the difficulties that self-evacuees face when they return to Fukushima prefecture and how they try to adapt to the presence of contamination. Of course, it goes beyond just the psychological burden of having to cope with an environment that is understood and experienced as contaminated, because it encompasses delicate social relationships, when the social environment itself tends to marginalize the expression of concerns. So this chapter is based on a subset of semi-structured interviews that I've conducted. First with DILEM, which was a project of the National Center for Scientific Research in Lyon. And of course, the analysis here is mine and does not reflect the position of the project. And then followed by my own fieldwork in 2018. So it's a little dated, and I think it would be really interesting to go back and do additional fieldwork now, like 4 or 5 years later, to see how their experiences have evolved. So the chapter is based on the smallest set of 8 families who were self-evacuees and who have returned. The evacuation periods vary from 10 months in the shortest period to 5.5 years. And the places they've evacuated to are also diverse, from Yamagata Prefecture in the east to Ishikawa in the west. Most interviews were conducted with women, but when it was possible to meet their partners, of course, that was also added to the data. So this is the part I'd like to go on, relatively quickly. So The issue of radioactivity is, of course, the fact that it's not really perceptible by the human body, and therefore there's a need to go through scientific instruments to visualize it, and then the results have to be interpreted, and this is necessary to construct radiations into risk. So Kuchinskaya, analyzing this process of making visible, as she calls it, in the context of post-Chernobyl Belarus, notes that radiations need to be articulated, that is recognized, explicated, and established as risks. And this process of articulation and the conditions in which it is made possible or not possible is extremely important to understand how risk is constructed, how it's perceived, and how it's at the end experienced. So in the case of Japan, very early on, we see that the issue of contamination has been framed as not being an acute and direct danger for the population's health. We see references made to literature, Chernobyl literature, and especially this idea that the main issue is actually mental health and not physical health. And there's a form of representation of contamination as being contained within the evacuation zone. We see also the emergence of a triple discourse on safety, solidarity, and recovery, which is both meant to reassure the local and national population, and it's also meant to galvanize the citizens in an effort to overcome the disaster. We see expressions of concerns regarding contamination depicted as stemming from lack of knowledge, of incorrect knowledge, and in the worst instances, it's labeled as harmful rumors, fuhyōhigai, and presented as a problematic behavior, which hurts the collective effort to overcome the triple disaster. So we see the implementation of risk communication events and campaigns. The most famous is the Eat to Support, so Tabete Owen. And we also see, so the goal is to spread correct knowledge, so tadashi chishiki, regarding radiation, and therefore to counter those harmful rumors. And we see them, this narrative appearing also in museums and exhibitions. And here on the picture is Komyutang, so the communication building of the Center for Environmental Creation. It's located in Miharu. It's really, really interesting. And one of the aims of the center is to respond to anxiety and questions from residents of Fukushima, and to help them help their understanding of radiation and environmental issues from a familiar perspective. And it's really interesting to see how this education is done and what is communicated. So self-evacuees are returning to an environment in which discussions regarding contamination are dwindling and concerns are often dismissed, either as unscientific or worse, unpatriotic, and therefore this limits the expression of dissent and their capacity for action. So this part was a bit too long, so I think I will go really quickly over. The idea is that when self-evacuees return, it's generally not because they feel that it is safe to return, but rather because they are facing life circumstances that make it difficult to continue evacuation. So it can be children who suffer from being apart from their fathers, because often women have evacuated with their children without their partners. It can be aging parents who need care because women are primary caregivers. It can be related to school, for example, where we see the will to have children go to school in the same school for their whole school years and avoid interrupting their education. So it becomes important to decide, do we do it here? Do we do it back home? And of course, in 2017, there was the end of the housing support, which was one of the only measure to support non-official evacuees, and that had an impact, especially economically, on households who then sometimes decide that they can't stay in evacuation anymore. And the question is how to return to a place that one doesn't feel safe, and how does one adapt everyday life to living with contamination. And of course, this means having to find new forms of normalcy, even though I think they wouldn't necessarily call it normality, because of course the environment they go back to looks the same, but it's very different. And they need to implement coping strategies to face the inevitable presence of radioactivity. And the strategies target different aspects of contamination. For example, when it comes to environmental contamination, they purchase Geiger counter, or they consult online contamination maps. They restrict outdoor activities, especially for children. So this picture, for example, is from an indoor playground built in Koreama after the accident, where parents would be more comfortable seeing their children play. Of course, a lot of things are related to food and how to prepare it, how to choose it, how to clean it, what is to be avoided or not, especially anything related to mushrooms and sansai. And of course, that is also very time consuming, and it can create financial burdens for families who used to rely on homegrown produce. So what is important in this, in implementing radioprotective measures, is that it provides individuals with the possibility to exercise a form of control over their surrounding, and it becomes a tool to reduce to a level the feeling of anxiety that is accompanying the presence of radioactivity. It gives a bit of visibility to what is imperceptible, and it makes it possible to make decisions according to one's own standards. However, of course, this is constrained by the fact that they live in an environment where discussing contamination, but also addressing it with measures is more and more difficult. And I think it's a really, really important point that comes out of those interviews, is that there is the emergence of a form of silence around contamination. So often they can't pinpoint one event where they felt, okay, this person had clearly told me I shouldn't talk about this. It's rather a general atmosphere, general feeling that one should not address the issue of contamination anymore, especially when one comes back from evacuation. So they feel compelled not to talk about radiation. They fear social disapproval, and they worry about either offending people or angering those who do not want to talk about it anymore. It happens within families, especially because there are differentiated risk perceptions, maybe gender, maybe based on age, also political opinions. And it also happens within communities. So my interviewees, for example, are very reluctant to engage with other people because it creates more strains, and it's stressful to wonder, okay, can I talk about this with this person or not? So there's a form of disengagement from communities. And of course, there's also fears of being seen as overly concerned. So this shinkesh is a really interesting word that unfortunately I don't have time to address here. That is also very gendered. It's applied to women. It's also medicalizing having concerns about radiation. And so what happens is that one has to negotiate what can be done, what can be said, and what in the end cannot really be addressed anymore. And in the chapter, I go through this finding a balance between one's risk perception and what is socially acceptable within the context of school as an institution. So parents struggle a lot to say, for example, oh, my child will not drink milk. So after the accident, it was possible to take children off the school milk. And after a while, it becomes more and more difficult, which schools will say, oh, no, like if you don't have an allergy, then it's not possible. And we see this flexibility disappearing, parents more and more constrained by schools and by school staff to not make a fuss in a way. And we see how, for example, notions of 지상 지쇼, so local production, local consumption, which is also part of the education, the food education, as they call it, is also playing a role in defining what can be said and what cannot be said anymore, because it becomes related to recovery. So just as a quick conclusion, we see that there's a construction of radioactive contamination as a contained risk, which is controlled through the implementation of evacuation, decontamination, and food monitoring on the authorities level. There's a national and local discourse on recovery, safety, and solidarity that limits the social visibility of risks related to radioactivity, and there's a call on the population to redirect its efforts towards the reconstruction. And this also means that there's expected behavior, and it is to resume one's normal life. So for the people I've been following, this means that when they return to Fukushima prefecture, they're compelled, they're not really feeling safe, they are compelled by life events, but they have to find ways to cope with both their own concerns and the fact that those concerns cannot be voiced. And as discussed in this presentation chapter, they need to implement new routines, but all of it has to be very discreet, very invisible to the others. And that creates also a lot of strain. So they both find agency in implementing radioprotection, but they really quickly find the limits to that agency. And what I find really important right now is that we see acceleration of this return policy, especially with the difficult to return zone. And there are also shifts in the feeling towards contamination, which becomes less addressed. And we saw with the Ukrainian conflict, but also this very, very hot summer, that there's also a shift in perception, in opinions, where the opinion is now that is opposing the restarting of nuclear power plants has dropped under 50%. It was the first time. And in this context, it will become more and more challenging for people like my interviewees to challenge the overall narrative that was created regarding the nuclear accident and its consequences after the disaster.